Monday morning, we all showed up to find the cafeteria doors chained shut. The sign read, "Closed until further notice due to food waste and disrespect." This wasn't some fancy school with multiple lunch options. We only had one cafeteria. The nearest gas station was a mile away, and leaving campus during lunch was explicitly forbidden. Principal Miss Blade made an announcement during first period, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "Due to the disrespect shown to our lunch staff on Friday, the cafeteria will remain closed until the perpetrator comes forward." The athletes were the first to struggle. The football team had morning conditioning. The swimmers had practice at 5:45 a.m. They were burning thousands of calories with nothing to replace it. Kids started sneaking granola bars, but Miss Blade caught on within hours. She sent an email to all teachers. "Confiscate any food immediately. Students need to understand actions have consequences." A group of student council kids, the responsible ones who never got in trouble, went to Miss Blade's office to reason with her. She sat behind her massive desk, arms folded, looking almost pleased. "This is a collective responsibility situation," she said. "When one person damages our community, we all feel the impact. Someone will eventually come forward. But Miss Blade, people have medical conditions." She smiled. "This is a valuable life lesson." By Tuesday, things were deteriorating. Kids with low blood sugar were getting shaky and dizzy. Teachers were getting nervous, but Miss Blade called it building character through adversity. I watched my friend Jason, a diabetic, have to go to the nurse's office 3 times to test his blood sugar because he couldn't eat on schedule. The nurse looked furious but helpless. Wednesday was when I knew something had to give. Midge collapsed during chemistry. The teacher, Mr. Stank, caught her before she hit the floor, and you could see the rage on his face as he called for help. Parents started calling, lots of parents. Miss Blade sent out a mass email about teaching responsibility and preparing students for the real world. And because this was rural Alaska, there was no other school in the district. That's when Sophie had her brilliant idea. Sophie was this quiet junior who'd never caused problems, but she was also the daughter of a lawyer and the granddaughter of a woman who'd been in the school board for 20 years. She gathered about 15 of us behind the gym after school. "If they want to play stupid games, they can win stupid prizes," she said, pulling out her phone. "Everyone text your parents. Tell them you need them to bring you lunch tomorrow. Not pack it, bring it. In person, during lunch period." The plan was beautiful. It wasn't against any written rule. Parents were technically allowed to visit campus, and if our parents just happened to show up during lunch to deliver food to their starving children, well, make sure they know to stay for as long as they want, Sophie added, grinning. Thursday at 11:30 a.m. it began. First, Alfred's mom showed up with Chick-fil-A. Then 2 minutes later, Ashley's dad arrived with pizza. Then Jennifer's mom with Panera. Within 15 minutes, the front parking lot was completely full. Parents were circling, looking for spaces, parking on the grass, blocking the fire lane. The front office had 3 staff members. By 11:45, there were over 100 parents in the building, all needing to sign in, all needing visitor badges. The fire marshal showed up at 12:15. Someone had called about the blocked fire lane and the overcrowding. You could hear him yelling about capacity limits and safety violations, while parents smiled sweetly and said they'd leave soon, right after they finished feeding their children. The afternoon classes were a disaster. So many parents had stayed that teachers couldn't start on time. Miss Blade's voice came over the PA, tight with anger. All visitors must vacate the building immediately. Friday, it got worse. The word had spread. Parents coordinated. At 11:25 a.m., we watched from classroom windows as the parking lot filled up. 300 parents all teaming up with the kids against the adults. Sophie's grandmother, the school board member, was there too. She'd brought Olive Garden for 12 kids and set up a full breadstick station in the commons. When security asked her to leave, she smiled and said, "I'm on the school board, honey. I'll leave when I'm done feeding these starving children." But then Friday night, Jason collapsed at home. His blood sugar had been so unstable all week that his body just gave out. When his parents sued the school Monday morning, Miss Blade did something none of us saw coming. She reopened the cafeteria but suspended Sophie for organizing the parents. The news hit my phone during first period math when everyone's notifications started going off at once. I pulled out my phone under my desk and saw the screenshot someone had posted in our group chat, an actual court filing with Jason's parents' names listed as plaintiffs and the school district as defendant. My hands started shaking as I scrolled through the comments, kids saying things like, "Holy crap, they actually did it," and "This is insane." The whispers started spreading across the classroom even though we were supposed to be working on equations. Sarah leaned over and asked if I'd seen it, and I nodded, feeling this weird mix of shock and hope building in my chest, because maybe something would actually change now. By the time the bell rang, the entire hallway was buzzing with people huddled around phones, showing each other the screenshots and talking in excited, nervous voices. I walked to second period feeling like the air had shifted somehow, like we'd crossed some line we couldn't uncross. The intercom crackled during second period English, and Miss Blade's voice came through tight and controlled. She called an emergency assembly in the gym immediately, and my stomach dropped as we all filed out of our classrooms. The gym was packed within minutes, everyone sitting on the bleachers while Miss Blade stood at center court with a microphone. She announced that effective immediately, the cafeteria would reopen for normal operations, and a bunch of kids started clapping until she held up her hand for silence. Then she said there would be a thorough conduct investigation into Friday's events, and her eyes scanned the crowd like she was looking for specific faces. That's when she dropped the bomb about Sophie being suspended pending review for organizing the parent demonstration, and you could feel the shock ripple through the whole gym. She said the visitor policy was changed right away to prevent future disruptions, and parents would need advance approval and specific time limits for any campus visits. I looked around trying to find Sophie in the crowd, and when I finally spotted her 3 rows down, her face had gone completely white. Miss Blade finished by saying that anyone found to have participated in planning or promoting unauthorized demonstrations would face disciplinary consequences, and then she dismissed us back to class like she hadn't just declared war on half the student body. I caught up with Sophie in the hallway right after the assembly ended, pushing through the crowd of kids who were all talking at once. She was standing against the lockers looking absolutely stunned, but she already had her phone out and her thumbs were flying across the screen. I asked if she was okay, and she looked up at me with this expression that was part shock and part determination. She told me she was texting her grandmother right now, and they were going to draft an appeal tonight because this was total retaliation. Her voice was shaking a little, but she kept typing, and she said her grandmother was already furious about the suspension, calling it punishment for protected speech. Sophie showed me part of the text chain where her grandmother had written that they had documentation of everything, every email and announcement and policy Miss Blade had sent out. I told Sophie I'd help however I could, and she nodded and said we'd need to organize, but carefully this time, because Miss Blade was clearly watching everyone now. The bell rang for third period, but neither of us moved right away, just stood there in the hallway while other kids rushed past us to their classes. During lunch, I was sitting in the cafeteria trying to eat the first hot meal we'd had in over a week when Caitlin Moore, the school nurse, walked over to my table. She asked if she could talk to me privately for a minute, and something about her expression made my stomach tighten. We walked over to the corner by the vending machines where it was quieter, and she kept her voice low as she told me she'd been documenting Jason's blood sugar readings all last week. She said every single reading was in her records as medically serious incidents, unstable levels that showed clear health impacts from not being able to eat on schedule. Caitlin looked genuinely worried as she explained that she'd already sent a memo to the administration, urging them to preserve all medical records because this could become evidence in the lawsuit. She said she was concerned about other students too, kids who'd struggled during the closure but never came to her office to report symptoms. I asked if she thought the documentation would actually help, and she nodded and said, "Medical records don't lie. They show exactly what happened to students' health during that week." She told me to spread the word that any student who'd experienced health problems should document it now while the details were still fresh, because memories fade but written records last. I thanked her and went back to my table feeling like at least one adult in this building was actually trying to protect us instead of covering for the administration. Between 4th and 5th period, I saw Jason for the first time since Friday night. He looked absolutely drained, his skin kind of grayish and his movements slow like everything took extra effort. A group of us, including Alfred and 2 other kids from the lunch protest, surrounded him in the hallway, and we all walked together toward the nurse's office so Caitlin could check his levels. Jason moved carefully like his body hurt, and when someone asked how he was feeling, he just shook his head. Inside the nurse's office, Caitlin had him sit down and pulled out her glucose meter, pricking his finger and waiting for the reading. While we waited, Jason told us his parents were already working with the district on formal medical accommodations, meetings scheduled and lawyers involved. He said the collapse Friday night had been terrifying, that he'd just been sitting on the couch watching TV when everything went fuzzy, and then he woke up in the emergency room. His voice was quiet when he said he'd never felt so tired in his entire life, like his body had just given up after fighting all week to function without proper food. The glucose meter beeped, and Caitlin frowned at the number, making a note in Jason's file before telling him he needed to eat something with protein right away. She pulled a protein bar from her desk drawer and handed it to him, and we all watched him eat it slowly, while Caitlin explained that his body was still recovering, and it might take weeks to fully stabilize. Jason nodded and said he knew, but you could see the frustration and exhaustion in his eyes. Tuesday morning, I was in first period when someone whispered that the superintendent's car was in the parking lot. I looked out the window and sure enough, there was this official district vehicle parked right by the main entrance. Word spread fast that Alden Weaver, the actual superintendent, was in the building, and by second period everyone knew he'd gone straight into a closed-door meeting with Miss Blade. The meeting lasted over an hour, and you could feel the tension building throughout the whole school as kids speculated about what was happening. Some people thought Miss Blade was getting fired right then and there. Others insisted Alden was probably backing her up, and the meeting was about handling the lawsuit. I kept refreshing my phone constantly hoping someone would leak information, checking our group chats and Instagram to see if anyone had insider knowledge. The meeting finally ended around 10:30, and we watched through classroom windows as Alden walked to his car alone, his face completely neutral and impossible to read. Miss Blade didn't make any announcements, didn't say anything about the meeting, and that silence somehow made everything feel worse because we had no idea what had been decided or what would happen next. By Tuesday afternoon, all the teachers had received some new directive because you could see it in their faces during class. Mr. Stank looked particularly tense as he handed back our chemistry homework, and between periods I heard two teachers talking in low voices about new policies. The official email came out around 2 p.m., and kids started passing around screenshots within minutes. The new rules included random bag checks at any time, stricter enforcement of the tardy policy with no grace period at all, and mandatory hall passes even for bathroom breaks. It felt like Miss Blade was doubling down on control instead of backing off, tightening her grip on the school in every way she still could. Ravi Dupree, the teachers' union rep, apparently called an emergency faculty meeting for right after school because Mr. Stank mentioned it quietly to a few of us as we left class. You could see the stress on all the teachers' faces as they tried to teach normally while clearly worried about what was happening behind the scenes. Some teachers looked angry, others just looked tired, but everyone seemed tense and on edge in a way that made the whole school feel unstable. That evening, I was scrolling Instagram when I got a DM from an account I didn't recognize. The profile said Penelope Reed and identified her as a reporter for the local paper. Her message was polite but direct, asking if I'd be willing to talk about the cafeteria closure and the parent protest for a story she was writing. My first instinct was to ignore it, but then I saw that Sophie had already responded to a similar message and agreed to go on record. I spent about an hour thinking about it, weighing whether talking to a reporter would make things better or worse. Finally, I decided that someone needed to tell the truth about what had actually happened, about kids collapsing and the confiscation policy, and how scared we'd all been. I messaged Penelope back and said I'd share my documentation, the notes I'd been keeping about when students had collapsed and when the food confiscation had started. We arranged to talk on the phone that night, and I spent 2 hours going through everything I'd written down, giving her specific dates and details and names of students who'd been affected. Sophie called me after her interview and said Penelope seemed genuinely interested in getting the facts right, not just writing some sensational story. Tuesday night around 9 p.m., Penelope's article went live on the paper's website. The headline read, "Rural Schools Food Ban Sparks Parent Revolt and Lawsuit," and within minutes my phone was blowing up with people sharing the link. I read through the whole article twice, and it was surprisingly fair, laying out the timeline of events and including quotes from both students and the district. The district's statement was completely bland, just saying they were reviewing policies and procedures and committed to student well-being, the kind of corporate speak that meant nothing. But then the comment section started filling up fast, and that's where things got heated. Parents from our community were sharing screenshots of Miss Blade's original email about confiscating food, the one that said students needed to understand consequences. Other people were defending Miss Blade, saying she was teaching valuable lessons about responsibility and that parents today were too soft on their kids. I watched the comments multiply, people taking sides and arguing back and forth, and it felt surreal to see our school situation becoming this public debate. Some comments were supportive, thanking students for standing up, but others were harsh, calling us spoiled and entitled and saying we needed to learn respect for authority. By Wednesday morning, the article had been shared hundreds of times across local Facebook groups and parent networks. Sophie texted me early saying her grandmother had already been working the phones, using her school board connections to push for an emergency agenda item at the next regular board meeting. Around 10 a.m., the official notice went up on the district website showing the updated agenda for next Thursday evening's board meeting, with a new item listed for public comment regarding cafeteria policies and student discipline. Sophie sent a screenshot to our group chat with the caption, "We have exactly 9 days to prepare," and suddenly the timeline became real and concrete. 9 days to organize testimony, gather supporters, document everything we wanted to say, and figure out how to make the board actually listen to students instead of just going through the motions of public comment. I started making lists during lunch, writing down everyone who might be willing to speak and what evidence we needed to compile. The board meeting felt like our one real chance to make adults in power actually hear what had happened and why it mattered, and I wasn't going to waste it. Wednesday morning, the PA crackled during third period, and the secretary's voice called my name to report to the main office. My stomach dropped because I knew this wasn't about attendance or a schedule change. I grabbed my backpack and walked down the empty hallway, my sneakers squeaking on the linoleum floors. The assistant principal met me at the door and led me into a small conference room with a table and 3 chairs. He sat across from me with a yellow legal pad and clicked his pen twice. He called it witness clarification, but the questions felt wrong from the start. "Did Sophie tell you to text your parents, or did you decide on your own? Did she give specific instructions about what to say? Did she mention wanting to cause disruption or just feed students?" I kept my answers short and stuck to facts. Sophie suggested we ask our parents to bring lunch. I texted my mom. Parents showed up. That's what I saw. He kept circling back to whether Sophie pressured anyone or planned the whole thing as organized protest. I could feel him trying to build a case against her instead of understanding why 300 parents felt they had no choice but to flood the school. After 20 minutes, he let me go, and I walked back to class feeling gross and manipulated, like I'd just been used as a tool against my friend. Mr. Stank caught me right after chemistry ended and pulled me aside near the lab equipment cabinets. He looked around to make sure no other students were in earshot. He told me he'd been documenting every incident he witnessed during the cafeteria closure, including the exact time Midge collapsed and his observations about students looking shaky and pale throughout that week. He said he was planning to speak at the union meeting and wanted me to know not all the adults were on Miss Blade's side. Some teachers had been scared to say anything publicly, but they'd been keeping records and taking notes. He told me the union rep was collecting statements from faculty who witnessed health impacts. Knowing that at least some teachers were willing to stand up made something loosen in my chest. I'd felt so alone in this mess, like it was just students against the entire administration. But Mr. Stank signing his name to documentation meant adults were paying attention, and some of them thought what happened was wrong enough to risk their jobs speaking up. Jason caught me at lunch Wednesday and told me his parents had filed for a temporary restraining order that afternoon. His mom was taking off work to go to the courthouse, and his dad was meeting with their lawyer to prepare for Thursday's hearing. The restraining order was supposed to protect his medical accommodations and prevent any payback for the lawsuit. Jason looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. He said his mom was going to testify about Friday night when he collapsed at home and the emergency room visit and how his blood sugar had been completely unstable all week. The doctors had written a letter documenting the health impacts from not being able to eat on schedule. Jason's hands shook a little when he showed me the court filing on his phone. The legal language was dense, but I could make out phrases about irreparable harm and medical necessity. Seeing it in official court documents made the whole situation feel more real and serious, like we'd crossed some line where this wasn't just school drama anymore, but actual legal action with lawyers and judges involved. Thursday morning, I went to the nurse's office for my regular check-in, and Caitlin pulled out a printed incident log with all the names blacked out, just numbers and dates and brief descriptions. The spike in visits during the closure week was absolutely shocking. Normally, she saw maybe 10 to 15 students per day for various issues. During that week, the numbers jumped to 40, 50, 60 students coming in with low blood sugar, dizziness, headaches, shakiness. She'd marked Jason's 3 visits in red along with 4 other students who came back multiple times. 2 students had to be sent home. 1 nearly passed out during gym class. Caitlin said this was the kind of evidence that proved the policy had real health impacts that could be measured and documented. She told me she was prepared to testify if she got subpoenaed, even though it would probably cost her the administration's trust and make her job harder. She'd already started updating her resume and looking at clinic positions because she wasn't sure she could keep working in a system that cared more about punishment than keeping students safe. The way she said it made me realize how much this had cost her too. Not just students, but the adults who tried to protect us. Friday morning, Miss Blade's voice came over the PA during homeroom announcements. Anyone who participated in organizing or promoting the parent lunch protest would serve Saturday detention for disrupting the educational environment. My homeroom teacher started handing out pink detention slips, and I got one along with at least 20 other students whose names got called. The slip said I had to report to the library Saturday morning at 8 a.m. for 4 hours of supervised study. The unfairness of it hit me hard, like getting punched in the stomach. We were literally just trying to eat lunch. We asked our parents to bring us food because the cafeteria was closed and we were starving. And now we were getting punished for it like we'd committed some major rule violation. Sophie got a slip even though she was already suspended. Alfred got one. The girl who'd just asked her dad to bring pizza got one. I shoved the pink paper into my backpack and tried to focus on the rest of the announcements, but I couldn't stop thinking about how twisted the whole thing was. The parents regrouped fast in a group chat that Sophie's mom shared with us students. By Friday afternoon, the messages were flying. They were planning to attend the board meeting next Thursday in huge numbers, but this time they'd follow every single check-in rule perfectly. Someone suggested wearing matching shirts that said, "Fed students learn better," and within an hour there was a design circulating with a breadstick graphic. The order form for bulk printing got passed around, and parents started claiming sizes. My mom texted me asking what size I wanted and whether she should order extras for friends. The energy in the chat was different now, more organized and strategic. Parents were coordinating carpools and childcare, so as many people as possible could attend. Someone created a shared document for people to sign up for speaking slots during public comment. Another parent started a list of specific policy changes to request. Watching adults organize with this level of detail and planning made me feel like we actually had a shot at changing something, instead of just yelling into the void. Word leaked through Mr. Stank Friday afternoon that the superintendent had met with all the department heads. Alden wanted to de-escalate without making admissions of wrongdoing. Those exact words. Mr. Stank told me during passing period, and I felt my blood start to boil. They were more worried about liability than actually fixing the problem or admitting Miss Blade had been wrong. De-escalate meant make it go away quietly. Without admissions meant never say sorry or take responsibility. The phrase made me so angry I had to stop walking and just stand there in the hallway for a minute. They were going to try to smooth this over and move on without actually acknowledging that closing the cafeteria and confiscating food had put students in danger. without admitting that a diabetic kid almost died, without saying they screwed up. Just de-escalate and protect the district from the lawsuit and make sure nobody important had to face real consequences. The fire marshal came back Friday for a follow-up inspection and issued a written warning to the district about capacity violations and blocked fire lanes from the parent protest. Penelope got a copy of the citation somehow and published it in her next article. I read through the official documentation that evening, seeing phrases like exceeded maximum occupancy and emergency egress blocked and failure to maintain clear fire lanes. It felt weirdly validating, even though we never meant to create safety problems. We were just trying to eat and our parents were just trying to feed us. But seeing it written up in official fire marshal language with violation codes and required corrective actions proved that what we did had real impact. The district couldn't just dismiss it as kids being dramatic or parents overreacting. There was actual documentation from a city official saying the protest had created serious safety concerns that needed to be addressed. Penelope filed a public records request for all emails related to the cafeteria closure and confiscation policy. By Monday, she published Miss Blade's exact words from the original staff email. I read the article on my phone during lunch, and there it was in print. Students need to understand actions have consequences. Confiscate any food immediately. This is a valuable life lesson. Seeing those words published for everyone to read, knowing Jason had nearly died, knowing kids had collapsed and gotten dizzy and gone to the nurse's office in record numbers, made the cruelty impossible to deny or spin. Miss Blade had written those words and sent them to every teacher. She'd ordered them to take food away from hungry students. She'd called it teaching responsibility. And now everyone could see exactly what she'd said and decide for themselves whether that was reasonable leadership or dangerous punishment. The union rep started circulating a draft no-confidence letter among the faculty and teachers were genuinely scared about signing it. Mr. Stank told me during passing period Monday that the debate was getting intense. Some teachers thought Miss Blade had been trying to teach responsibility and that the situation got blown out of proportion. Others thought she'd endangered students and needed to be removed. But everyone was worried about their jobs because this was rural Alaska with limited opportunities, and if you got labeled as a troublemaker, you might not find another teaching position within 100 miles. The letter needed a certain number of signatures to be official, and Ravi was pushing hard to get enough names. Teachers were meeting in small groups after school, arguing about whether signing was the right move or career suicide. Mr. Stank said he was going to sign it because he couldn't live with himself if he stayed quiet after watching Midge collapse in his classroom. But he understood why other teachers were hesitating, and he didn't judge them for being scared. Tuesday night, my phone rang at 8:47 p.m., and Sophie's name lit up the screen. I answered and immediately knew something was wrong because her voice sounded thick and shaky. She told me some kids were saying she should just accept the suspension and stop fighting it because her appeal was making everything worse for everyone. I sat down on my bed and asked her who was saying that. She named 3 student council kids who'd been part of the original protest planning. They'd pulled her aside after school and told her the district would go easier on everyone else if she took the fall alone. I felt my stomach drop because that was exactly the kind of divide and conquer tactic Miss Blade would want. We talked for over an hour, and I kept telling Sophie that appealing on principle mattered more than taking heat off other people. If they could suspend her for organizing parents to bring lunch, they could punish anyone for anything next time. The precedent would be set that student organizing equals punishment. Sophie kept saying she was scared of making her college applications harder or getting labeled as a troublemaker. I understood that fear completely, but I also knew that backing down now would tell the administration they could get away with anything. By the time we hung up around 10 p.m., Sophie sounded steadier and said she was going to keep fighting the appeal. I lay in bed afterward feeling exhausted from trying to hold her up when I was barely holding myself together. Wednesday crawled by with normal classes but weird tension everywhere. Kids were whispering about what might happen at the board meeting next week. Thursday lunch started normally with everyone getting food from the reopened cafeteria. Then, at exactly 11:38 a.m., Alfred stood up in the middle of the commons holding a glucose tablet in his hand. He didn't say anything, just sat back down and placed the tablet on the table in front of him. Within 2 minutes, other kids started doing the same thing. Some had glucose tablets, others had empty granola bar wrappers, a few had juice boxes they weren't drinking. Everyone just sat there completely silent, staring at the food items in front of them. The cafeteria got eerily quiet as more students joined in. By 11:45, probably 200 kids were sitting in total silence with medical snacks or food packaging displayed on their tables. Nobody was eating anything. Nobody was talking. We just sat there making our point about what Miss Blade had forced us to do during the closure. I watched the cafeteria monitors look confused and uncomfortable. Around noon, Miss Blade walked through the commons and her face went tight with anger. She stopped in the middle of the room and looked around at all of us. You could see her wanting to punish someone, but there was nothing to punish. We weren't breaking any rules. We were just sitting quietly with food we weren't eating. She stood there for maybe 30 seconds that felt like forever, then walked out without saying anything. The protest continued through the entire lunch period. When the bell rang at 12:25, everyone picked up their items and threw them away or put them back in bags. Still, nobody talked. We just went to fifth period like nothing had happened. But something had definitely happened, and everyone knew it. Thursday afternoon at 2:15 p.m., Jason's parents went to the courthouse for the temporary restraining order hearing. Jason texted our group chat updates every few minutes. His parents presented his affidavit describing the collapse and how he still felt exhausted weeks later. They had medical records from the emergency room visit and documentation from Caitlin about his unstable blood sugar readings during the cafeteria closure. The district's lawyer tried to argue that accommodations were already in place and the restraining order was unnecessary. But Jason's mom apparently destroyed that argument by pointing out the accommodations only existed because they sued, and nothing prevented the district from removing them again. The judge asked specific questions about Jason's current health status and what accommodations he needed. At 3:47 p.m., Jason texted that the judge granted the order. It required immediate medical accommodations, including unrestricted access to snacks and water during school hours. The order also explicitly prohibited any reprisals connected to his healthcare needs or his family's lawsuit. Jason added 3 exclamation points to his text. It felt like a real legal win, even though it only protected one student. The order didn't change policy for everyone else, but at least Jason was safe now. I texted back congratulations and felt this weird mix of relief for him and frustration that the rest of us were still vulnerable. Thursday evening around 6:30 p.m., Sophie sent a screenshot to our group chat. The district compliance office had sent out a memo requiring that all cafeteria operations meet medical accommodation standards immediately. The memo said they needed to maintain consistent food service and couldn't close the cafeteria again without triggering ADA violations. Sophie added 3 celebration emojis and the message, "We did it." I read through the memo twice, looking for loopholes or ways they could weasel out of it, but the language seemed pretty clear. The cafeteria had to stay open and accessible. For the first time in weeks, I felt like we'd actually created some breathing room and protection. Not just for Jason, but for everyone who needed regular meals. I saved the screenshot in my documentation folder and sent Sophie a thumbs-up emoji. That night, I actually slept better than I had since this whole thing started. Friday morning destroyed that good feeling immediately. Miss Blade's voice came over the PA during first period announcements. She said the school was implementing enhanced hallway monitoring and a stricter tardy policy effective immediately. Any student more than 30 seconds late to class would receive automatic detention. No warnings, no excuses. Hallway sweeps would happen between every period. I looked around my English classroom and saw other kids looking equally shocked. By second period, the hallway sweeps had started. Security guards and administrators stood at major intersections timing students. I watched a freshman girl get stopped and written up for being 25 seconds late because she'd stopped at her locker. The detention slip got handed to her right there in the hallway. By lunch, everyone was exhausted and angry. The retaliation was so obvious it hurt. We couldn't win without Miss Blade finding new ways to punish us. The cafeteria was open, but school life was harder in every other way she could control. Kids were practically running between classes to avoid being 31 seconds late. The stress was worse than before in some ways, because at least during the closure, we knew what we were fighting. Now it felt like fighting smoke. Friday afternoon, I had a scheduled check-in with Caitlin because of the whole situation. I sat in her office and she looked tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. She told me she was limited by the chain of command and couldn't publicly contradict administration without risking her job. Everything she did had to go through proper channels. She was documenting every incident meticulously to protect both students and herself, creating a paper trail in case things got worse or turned legal. But I could see the struggle on her face as she talked about watching kids suffer while following institutional rules that protected the system over students. She said she'd applied to a few clinic positions outside the school district. Not because she wanted to leave, but because she wasn't sure she could stay in a system that worked like this. I thanked her for everything she'd been doing and told her I understood if she needed to leave. She gave me this sad smile and said she hoped it wouldn't come to that, but she had to protect herself too. Walking out of her office, I felt grateful she was documenting everything, but also scared about what would happen if she actually left. Penelope's next article posted Friday evening, and I read it on my phone before dinner. She'd interviewed a parent who fully supported Miss Blade. The parent called her a strong leader willing to make tough choices, said kids today need to learn consequences, and that we were all spoiled for complaining about missing a few meals. The parent talked about how their generation walked to the school uphill both ways and never whined about being hungry. Reading someone from our own community defend what happened made me so mad I had to put my phone down. But it also forced me to recognize this wasn't a simple story where everyone agreed on right and wrong. Our community was genuinely divided. Some people thought Miss Blade had endangered students. Others thought she was teaching valuable lessons about responsibility. That split was going to make the board meeting even harder because we weren't just fighting the administration. We were fighting against some of our own neighbors who thought collective punishment built character. The board meeting notice hit local Facebook groups Friday night, and by Saturday morning, the comment wars were absolutely brutal. I scrolled through the threads feeling sick. People were calling students spoiled brats who needed to learn respect. Other people were calling Miss Blade a dangerous administrator who shouldn't be near kids. Threats about recalls and lawsuits flew in every direction. Someone posted Miss Blade's home address before moderators deleted it. Parents were attacking each other personally. Former friends were going after each other in comment threads. I started screenshotting the worst comments and saving them in a folder because some of this felt like it crossed into harassment territory. If things escalated further, I wanted documentation of who said what. The toxicity was overwhelming and it was only Saturday. The actual board meeting wasn't until Thursday. I couldn't imagine how bad things would get by then. Friday afternoon, Mr. Stank had signed the no-confidence letter. Ravi sent an email to all faculty Friday evening announcing the vote would happen Monday during the staff meeting. I heard about it through Mr. Stank, who stopped me in the hallway Friday before I left school. He looked relieved to have made the decision, but also nervous about potential consequences. Knowing that teachers were willing to formally declare they'd lost faith in Miss Blade's leadership gave me hope, but I also knew the district could completely ignore the vote if they wanted to. It was more symbolic than binding. The board didn't have to fire Miss Blade just because teachers voted no confidence. Still, having that vote on record before the board meeting felt important. It showed this wasn't just students and parents complaining. The faculty themselves had lost trust in their principal's judgment and leadership. Saturday morning, Sophie texted, asking if I could come over Sunday night to help her practice her board meeting statement. Her grandmother was coaching her all weekend on proper procedures. How to request speaking time, the 3-minute limit, staying calm and factual instead of emotional. Sunday evening, I showed up at Sophie's house around 6 p.m. Her grandmother was there with printed copies of board meeting rules and a timer. Sophie had written out her statement longhand on notebook paper. She practiced reading it while her grandmother timed her and gave feedback. Cut that part, it sounds too angry. Add specific dates there, facts matter more than feelings. Slow down when you read the policy violations, let them sink in. I sat on Sophie's couch watching her transform from a suspended kid into someone who could professionally advocate for herself and others. By the third run-through, she had it down. Her voice stayed steady. She hit all the key points. She stayed under 3 minutes. Her grandmother smiled and said she was ready. Watching that transformation genuinely inspired me and made me believe we might actually be heard at the board meeting. Sophie wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone, and she knew exactly how to make that case effectively. Monday morning, I got to the school early and was heading to my locker when Alden stopped me in the hallway. He had 2 other student leaders with him, kids from student council who'd spoken up during the crisis. Alden smiled and gestured for us to step into an empty classroom. He closed the door, and his tone was friendly but serious. He told us the board meeting Thursday was going to be intense, and that he understood we had strong feelings about what happened. He said emotional outbursts would hurt our credibility with board members, and that maintaining a respectful tone would help our cause more than anger. It all sounded reasonable until I really thought about what he was asking. He wanted us to make the district look good, while they decided whether to actually hold Miss Blade accountable for nearly killing kids. He was asking us to tone down our truth so the adults wouldn't feel uncomfortable hearing it. I nodded and said I understood, but walking out of that classroom I felt manipulated. Alden wasn't actually on our side. He was protecting the district's reputation and using us to do it. His supposed support felt hollow and calculated, like he cared more about optics than actual change. Saturday morning, I showed up at Sophie's house again to help with her suspension appeal. She'd printed out district policy documents and highlighted sections about student speech and parent involvement. We spent 3 hours at her kitchen table drafting a statement that methodically explained how organizing parents to deliver lunch violated no written rules. Sophie cited specific policy numbers and dates. She documented that parents were allowed on campus with proper sign-in procedures. She showed that student advocacy was protected under district guidelines about free expression. The legal precision of her argument was impressive. Her grandmother reviewed it twice and made small edits for clarity. By noon, we had a formal appeal packet with documentation, witness statements, and policy citations. Sophie's hands shook slightly as she sealed the envelope. She told me she was scared but also angry enough to fight. I watched her walk to the mailbox and drop the appeal in. The legal precision made me think she might actually win this. Monday, the cafeteria reopened with longer hours and more food options. The district had clearly panicked about the lawsuit and added morning and afternoon service windows. But the execution was terrible. Lines stretched down the hallway during lunch because they hadn't hired enough staff. Kids were waiting 30 minutes just to get food. The quality was awful too. Everything looked and tasted like it came from the cheapest bulk supplier. Athletes were still struggling because even with longer hours, there wasn't enough protein or calories to sustain people doing morning conditioning and afternoon practice. I watched football players grab 3 sandwiches and still look hungry. The swimmers were eating protein bars between classes because the cafeteria food wasn't enough. The whole situation showed that just reopening wasn't enough. The underlying problems with school food were still completely unaddressed. We'd won the battle to reopen, but the system remained broken and underfunded. Tuesday, a rumor started spreading that completely changed how I thought about the original cafeteria closure. Multiple people were saying the initial disrespect to lunch staff wasn't even a student. Supposedly, it was a coach who'd complained about portion sizes being too small for athletes. Nobody could confirm it, and there was no proof, but the possibility made sense. Coaches had been vocal about food issues for months. If the whole nightmare actually started because an adult complained and Miss Blade decided to punish students for it, that made the collective punishment even more insane. I asked around trying to verify the rumor, but everyone had heard it from someone else. No one had first-hand knowledge. Still, the possibility that we'd all suffered because of adult behavior made me absolutely furious. The absurdity of punishing hundreds of kids for something a coach might have done felt like peak administrative dysfunction. Penelope published a new article Tuesday afternoon that gave me hope. The headline was about collective punishment in schools, and she'd interviewed education policy experts from universities. The experts explained why punishing entire groups for individual actions harms students and violates basic fairness principles. They cited research about how collective punishment damages trust and creates hostile learning environments. Seeing outside authorities validate what we'd been saying felt important. These weren't just angry students complaining. These were professors and researchers confirming that Miss Blade's approach was educationally unsound and ethically wrong. I shared the article on every platform I could think of. I texted it to parents, posted it in group chats, put it on my Instagram story. I wanted every board member to see that experts agreed with us before Thursday's meeting. Wednesday afternoon, things got more intense. The assistant principal started pulling students out of class for individual questioning. They took Sophie, me, and at least 5 others I knew about. Each time they asked us to come alone without calling our parents first. In my session, they asked who organized the parent lunch plan and who knew about it in advance. They wanted to know if Sophie had pressured anyone or if parents acted independently. The questions felt designed to build a case against Sophie rather than actually understand what happened. After school, we compared notes in the parking lot and realized they'd asked everyone similar questions. The pattern was obvious. They were trying to gather evidence to justify Sophie's suspension and maybe punish more people. We started a shared document logging every interaction with administration. Dates, times, exact questions, who was present. If they were building a case, we needed our own documentation of their investigation tactics. Thursday morning brought good news for Jason specifically. The judge converted his temporary restraining order into a longer accommodation order. The order specifically protected his medical needs and guaranteed his right to food access regardless of school policies. Jason texted me a photo of the court document, and I felt relieved that he was legally protected now. But the victory felt incomplete. The order only covered Jason's individual case. It didn't change broader school policy or protect other students with medical needs. Everyone else remained vulnerable if Miss Blade or another administrator decided to implement collective punishment again. I was glad Jason was safe, but frustrated that the system still allowed this kind of thing to happen to others. Thursday afternoon, the union vote finally happened. Ravi had been organizing for over a week, and teachers voted during their staff meeting. The no-confidence measure passed, but only by about 60%. That meant 40% of teachers either supported Miss Blade or were too scared to vote against her. The district was legally required to acknowledge the vote, but didn't have to take any action. It was more of a public statement than actual leverage. Still, seeing it reported in Penelope's coverage added pressure. The board would know that a majority of teachers had formally declared they'd lost faith in their principal's leadership. That had to mean something even if it wasn't legally binding. Friday, I stopped by the nurse's office to check my blood pressure for a sports physical, and Caitlin looked exhausted. We talked while she took my vitals, and she told me she was actively interviewing for positions at clinics and private practices. She explained that the moral injury of watching students suffer while being unable to fully protect them was damaging her mental health. She said staying in a system that prioritized control over student well-being felt unsustainable. I completely understood, even though the thought of losing her was devastating. Caitlin was the one adult in the building who consistently advocated for students. She documented everything and pushed back where she could. But she also had to protect herself. I told her I'd support whatever decision she made and thanked her for everything she'd done for us. Friday afternoon, word started spreading through parent networks about Alden's newest idea. He was floating the concept of an independent review to board members. Parents were sharing screenshots of emails and text messages discussing it. The whole thing felt like political cover. Alden wanted a way to look responsive without directly firing Miss Blade or admitting the district had screwed up. An independent review would buy time and create the appearance of accountability without requiring immediate action. The calculated nature of it made me cynical about whether real institutional change was possible, but I also recognized this might be the only realistic path to any accountability at all. The board wasn't going to fire Miss Blade outright, and the district wasn't going to admit wrongdoing. An independent review might be the best we could hope for, even if it felt like a compromise designed to protect adults rather than students. Monday morning, Sophie walked into the district office building downtown for her appeal hearing. The building smelled like old carpet and coffee. A secretary directed her to a conference room on the second floor, where 3 people from the district office sat behind a long table with folders and laptops spread out in front of them. Sophie had her documentation organized in a binder with color-coded tabs marking different sections. She sat across from the panel and pulled out her notes. The woman in the middle introduced herself as the district's compliance officer and the two men as HR representatives. Sophie started her presentation by citing the exact district policy about student speech and parent involvement. She showed them the visitor policy handbook, proving parents were allowed on campus during lunch. She walked through the timeline of events with dates and times documented. The compliance officer interrupted her twice to ask about who coordinated the parent communication. Sophie answered directly that she sent the initial text, but parents made their own decisions about participating. One of the HR reps asked if she understood why the administration viewed the lunch disruption as problematic. Sophie responded that she understood their perspective, but the cafeteria closure created medical emergencies that required immediate response. The panel members looked at each other, and the compliance officer made notes on her laptop. They asked about Sophie's intentions and whether she meant to cause capacity violations. Sophie explained she only wanted to make sure students could eat lunch and had no idea so many parents would show up. The questioning went on for 40 minutes. The panel said they needed to review the documentation and deliberate privately. They would issue a written decision within 1 week. Sophie gathered her materials and left the building feeling completely drained. The waiting felt worse than the hearing itself, because now her academic record hung in limbo while bureaucrats decided her fate. That same week, some parents started drafting recall petition language targeting Miss Blade and the board members who supported her. The language was harsh and accusatory. Sophie's grandmother heard about it through her board connections and called an emergency meeting at her house Tuesday night. About 15 parents showed up in her living room. The grandmother explained that recall petitions required thousands of signatures and months of work. She argued they should wait for the board vote on Thursday and use the recall threat as leverage only if the board refused to act. She said premature recall efforts would make the board defensive and less likely to vote for accountability. Her experience with local politics carried weight. Most parents agreed to hold off on the recall petition for now. They would focus their energy on showing up for the board meeting and delivering powerful testimony instead. The grandmother made everyone promise not to file any petitions until after Thursday's vote. People left her house frustrated but willing to follow her strategic guidance. Wednesday night, I stood in my bathroom practicing my board meeting speech in front of the mirror. I had written out talking points on index cards with specific dates and facts. September 18th, when Midge collapsed in chemistry. September 19th, when Miss Blade sent the confiscation email. September 25th, when the fire marshal issued citations. October 2nd, when the judge granted Jason's medical accommodation order. I timed myself speaking and kept going over 3 minutes. I edited out the parts where I called Miss Blade's actions cruel and focused on documented outcomes instead. My hands shook as I held the index cards. I practiced making eye contact with my reflection. I rewrote the ending 3 times, trying to sound clear instead of angry. My mom knocked on the bathroom door asking if I was okay. I told her I was fine and kept practicing. I knew if I could just get through 3 minutes of factual testimony without my voice cracking, I would have done everything possible to make our case. I practiced until my throat felt dry, and the words stopped sounding like real language. Thursday evening, the district office parking lot was already full when we arrived at 6:30. Cars lined both sides of the street. People walked toward the building in groups carrying signs and folders. The boardroom had maybe 80 chairs, but over 200 people showed up. Families packed the hallway outside with kids sitting on the floor. Security opened the overflow area in an adjacent room with a video feed. The board members filed in looking nervous. Philip Gordon, the board president, called the meeting to order and explained the public comment rules. 3 minutes per speaker. Stay on topic. No personal attacks. The sign-up sheet had 47 names. I was number 12. My stomach felt tight as I waited for my turn. When Philip called my name, I walked to the podium with my index cards. I stated my name and grade for the record. Then I went through the specific dates when students collapsed and the documented health impacts. I mentioned the confiscation email and read the exact quote about actions having consequences. I cited the medical accommodation order and the fire marshal citations. I explained that collective punishment created measurable harm to students with medical needs. My 3 minutes ended right as I finished my last sentence. I walked back to my seat and my legs felt weak. Jason testified next about his collapse and the ongoing fatigue that kept him out of basketball. His voice stayed steady, but you could see the exhaustion in his face. Sophie described how the suspension affected her college applications and explained that organizing parents were protected speech. Parent after parent stood up and shared how they felt forced to disrupt school just to feed their hungry children. One mom cried while describing her daughter's low blood sugar episodes. A dad talked about missing work to deliver lunch. The testimony kept coming for over an hour. The weight of all those voices saying the same thing felt powerful. Immediately after public comments ended, Alden stood up and walked to the front. He had a presentation loaded on his laptop connected to the projector. He went through his findings, slide by slide. Policy missteps that created health risks. Fire safety citations from blocked lanes and capacity violations. Legal exposure from Jason's lawsuit and the accommodation orders. Documentation of multiple student medical incidents during the closure week. He showed a graph of nurse office visits that spiked dramatically. He presented the union no-confidence vote results. Then he made his recommendation for administrative leave pending an independent review. His presentation lasted 20 minutes and covered everything with surprising honesty about institutional failures. He acknowledged the district should have intervened sooner. He admitted the collective punishment approach violated best practices. Watching him present the case against his own employee felt strange. Part of me respected his willingness to be candid. Another part felt angry that it took a lawsuit and media coverage to get this level of accountability. The board members asked him clarifying questions about the review timeline and who would serve as interim principal. Then Philip gave Miss Blade 15 minutes to respond. She walked to the podium looking completely calm. She started by saying she stood by her decision to close the cafeteria as a teaching moment about collective responsibility. She explained that students needed to learn that individual actions affect the whole community. She said the manufactured crisis was blown out of proportion by parents who coddle their children instead of letting them face consequences. She argued that resilience comes from adversity, and modern students lack the toughness previous generations had. She claimed the parent lunch disruption proved her point about entitlement. She said she would make the same decision again because leadership requires making unpopular choices. About a third of the audience started clapping when she finished. The applause shocked me. I looked around and saw parents and some teachers actually supporting her. The community was genuinely split about whether tough discipline mattered more than student health. Miss Blade sat down looking satisfied. Philip called for the board vote on Alden's recommendation. The board members each stated their position. 4 voted yes for administrative leave, 3 voted no. The margin was 4-3. Philip announced that Miss Blade would be placed on paid administrative leave, effective immediately pending the independent review. Wayne Moore would serve as interim principal starting Friday morning. Half the room erupted in cheers. The other half booed loudly. People started yelling at each other. Security stepped forward. Philip banged his gavel, calling for order. I sat in my chair feeling exhausted relief but no sense of celebration. The narrow vote proved how easily this could have gone the other way. 3 board members thought Miss Blade did nothing wrong. That reality felt heavy. Friday morning, Wayne called an all-staff meeting before first period. He announced the blanket confiscation policy was immediately rescinded. The extreme tardy enforcement would return to normal standards. The cafeteria would remain open with explicit protection for medical accommodations. He said he was reviewing the Saturday detention list and reducing most to written warnings. A few students, including me, still had to serve 1 session, but most got off completely. It felt unfair that I still had detention after everything, but also like a small price for what we won. Teachers looked relieved during the meeting. Students started talking in the hallways about the changes. The atmosphere felt lighter, even though nothing was fully resolved. Friday afternoon, I was in chemistry when my phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. Her appeal decision came back. The suspension was reduced to a written warning that would stay on her record but would not appear on transcripts sent to colleges. She sent me a screenshot of the official letter. The decision acknowledged the punishment was excessive given the circumstances. Sophie texted that she was accepting it instead of fighting further. She was exhausted and wanted to focus on the policy reform work ahead rather than more appeals. I understood completely. The partial victory was better than nothing. At least the reduced penalty recognized she did not deserve a full suspension. Penelope's follow-up article posted Saturday morning with quotes from board members explaining their votes. The ones who voted yes talked about accountability and student safety. The ones who voted no defended Miss Blade's leadership and criticized parent overreach. The article included reactions from community members on both sides. I made the mistake of reading the comment section. People were attacking each other with personal insults and threats. Someone called Sophie's family a bunch of entitled lawyers. Another person said Miss Blade should sue for defamation. The toxicity kept going for hundreds of comments. Sophie called me Saturday afternoon, and we talked about stepping back from social media. The vitriol was affecting both our mental health. We agreed to stop reading comments and focus on the actual policy reform process. We needed to protect ourselves while staying engaged in the work that mattered. The online fighting was not productive, and we could not control what strangers said about us. We decided to let the adults argue online while we focused on making real changes through proper channels. The weekend passed in this weird, quiet space where nothing felt settled. Monday morning, I walked into school and the atmosphere was different. Teachers looked less tense in the hallways. Wayne stood by the main entrance greeting students, which Miss Blade never did. He smiled at people and asked how their weekends went. It felt strange but good. First period, mister. Stank seemed more relaxed during chemistry. He actually made a joke about molecular bonds that got a few laughs. But after class, when I stopped to ask about an assignment, he pulled me aside near the lab sinks. He told me he got called into a meeting with HR Friday afternoon. They told him and 3 other teachers to be careful about public statements criticizing district leadership. They didn't threaten anyone directly, but the message was clear. Keep your head down, or there could be consequences. Mr. Stank said he was focusing on teaching and documenting things quietly from now on. He would keep records of what happened in his classroom, but he wasn't going to speak at any more meetings or sign any more letters. I understood why he had to protect himself. Teachers have families and bills and limited job options in rural Alaska, but part of me wished adults had more protection to speak up without risking everything. Tuesday during lunch, I saw Caitlin in the nurse's office for a routine check. She looked tired, but also kind of excited. She told me she got a job offer from a family clinic in town. Better pay, better hours, weekends off. She could have a normal schedule instead of dealing with emergencies and administrative pressure. But she was genuinely torn about leaving. She cared about the students and wanted to keep fighting for better policies. We talked for probably 20 minutes about whether staying was worth it. She said she was setting firm boundaries either way. If she stayed, she would advocate through proper channels, but she wouldn't sacrifice her mental health anymore. If she left, she would train her replacement to keep documenting incidents and protecting students. She needed to make a decision by the end of the week. I told her I would support whatever she chose because she deserved to take care of herself too. Over the next 2 weeks, Jason got better. His blood sugar stabilized with consistent meal schedules. The cafeteria staff knew his accommodations now and made sure he could grab food whenever he needed it. But he missed a basketball game because he was still regaining his stamina. His body had been through too much stress. I sat with him at lunch one day, and he told me his parents were in settlement negotiations with the district. Their lawyer was handling it separately from all the policy reform stuff. The district wanted to settle quickly and quietly. Jason's family wanted enough money to cover his medical bills and compensate for what happened. It felt weird to me that the legal process was so separate from the changes we were trying to make. Jason was getting compensation, but that didn't fix things for everyone else. The first week of December, Alden called me and Sophie to his office along with 6 other students. He said he was forming a student advisory committee to draft an anti-collective punishment policy. We would also review medical accommodation procedures to make sure they actually protected students. The committee would include administrators and 2 board members. We would meet twice a month starting in January. The whole process would take months, maybe until spring. That timeline frustrated me because it felt so slow. Kids could get hurt again while we were drafting policies and going through approval processes. But Sophie pointed out that having formal input into district policy was real progress. We would actually help write the rules instead of just complaining about them. That felt meaningful even if it was slower than I wanted. My friend group had some tension building around this time. We met up at someone's house one Saturday and things got uncomfortable. Some people thought we pushed too hard with the parent protest and made everything worse. Others thought we should have done more, like organized a full walkout. We argued for a while about tactics and whether the outcome was worth it. Finally, Sophie suggested we just be honest with each other. We went around and apologized for snap judgments we made about each other's choices. I admitted I got frustrated when people didn't want to take risks. Someone else admitted they thought I was being reckless. It was uncomfortable, but it felt like we were actually repairing our relationships instead of letting resentment build. We agreed we could disagree about strategy while still supporting each other. We committed to staying friends even when we didn't see everything the same way. That conversation mattered more than I expected. One evening in early December, I spent 3 hours organizing all my documentation. I had emails from teachers, photos of detention slips, notes from meetings, screenshots of Miss Blade's announcements. I created a cloud folder with everything organized by date and topic. I made backups on 2 different services because this evidence might matter for the independent review. It could also help with future policy discussions if the district tried to backtrack. While I was organizing everything, I wrote myself a reflection about staying involved without burning out. I was learning that activism couldn't be this constant, intense fight. I needed to pace myself and protect my mental health. I could care about making things better while also setting boundaries about how much energy I gave to it. That balance was hard but necessary. By mid-December, small wins started showing up. The student handbook got updated with formal language about medical snack allowances. Any student with documented health needs could keep food and eat it when necessary. The cafeteria added 2 new healthy options after Wayne asked for student feedback. They weren't amazing, but they were better than the old stuff. Wayne also announced monthly meetings with student representatives to address concerns before they became huge problems. None of this fixed everything. Miss Blade's administrative leave was still temporary. The independent review was still happening. Jason's lawsuit was still going through the courts. Our community was still divided about whether Miss Blade was a strong leader or had endangered students. But the changes felt real and earned. We had actually created tangible improvements through our actions. Friday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. Just a breadstick emoji with the caption "We did it." I sent back a laughing emoji because we both understood what she meant. We didn't fully win. The situation wasn't resolved, but we definitely changed something important. The coalition we built was still here. We were ready to keep pushing for students to be treated with dignity and basic fairness. The work wasn't done, but we proved that students could make adults listen when we organized and documented everything and refused to give up. That knowledge felt powerful, even though everything was still uncertain. And that's today's wrap-up. I like telling stories, but I love when they double as lessons too. Hopefully this one stuck with you. Subscribe if you'd like more stories with takeaways built in.